If I had to identify the single most helpful concept in understanding how gardening works, I would say fermentation. Fermentation sits at the center of almost everything that I do as a gardener. And I hope to convince you to start seeing your own gardening practice in a similar light. And while gardening culture has taken great strides toward viewing the craft through this lens, it continues to surprise me how little we consider the work of fermentation when it comes to building healthy soil and harvesting healthy plants. And before we go any further, welcome back to the channel. My name is Taylor, and I help gardeners explore sustainable and regenerative growing techniques that move beyond the standard and often blindly accepted but unhelpful norms. And one of the ways that I hope to empower you as a gardener is by equipping you with helpful resources that you can use in your gardening practice. So feel free to hit the link in the description or scan the code on the screen, and you can get access to some of the free resources that we make available. I'll be talking through some of these in this video. So fermentation, what is it? What is so important about it? Why does it matter? Well, first of all, at a very basic level, fermentation is defined as the chemical alteration of a substance by bacteria, yeast, and other microorganisms. On a less scientific level, but perhaps an equally informative one, we could look at the Latin word for fermentation, which means to boil. This term was actually used to describe the process of converting grapes into wine in ancient Rome, since what they saw was something that looked similar to what happened if you heated liquid over a fire. Bubbles were forming and popping on the surface of the vat of grapes. But far beyond bubbling grape juice, fermentation is actively boiling in nearly every area of our world all the time. Substances are in a constant flux of being composed and decomposed and altered, much of which is occurring invisibly, but which has extreme implications for life in general, and certainly life for gardeners. I'm going to boldly state that the process of building healthy soil for a garden really starts to make sense in a new way when we start to understand this multifaceted and infinitely complex process of fermentation. A parallel word to ferment is culture, and culture is one of those words that in English at least is both a noun and a verb. It can refer to a living community that contains unique characteristics and qualities, and it can also refer to the intentional act of growing, maintaining, and stewarding life. An example of culturing that most people would be familiar with is the process of making yogurt. To make yogurt, you heat up milk to a certain temperature, you cool it back down, and then you culture it by introducing a culture of specific bacteria, largely lactobacilli. And then you keep the yogurt at a certain temperature range, usually around 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And after a few hours, the culture will culture the milk. This is a fermentation process. Bacteria is chemically altering the milk proteins, changing the composition in such a way that transforms the product into a thick, creamy, and tangy, delicious substance called yogurt. Another radically different example of using this word culture would be if you travel to another country, or even just a different part of your own country, you'll encounter a culture that, at least in some ways, will be different to the one that you are used to. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, just north of Seattle, Washington. Now I live outside of Spokane, and a few years ago I traveled to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I experienced some culture shock. First of all, as a Northwesterner, I'm used to there being sidewalks just about everywhere. And so I had my Uber driver take me and some friends from the airport to a coffee shop near the Airbnb where we were staying. And when we went to walk to the Airbnb from a coffee shop, we couldn't find a sidewalk. And I noticed this going forward in my time spent in Tulsa. Not as many sidewalks as I was used to. So we just had to haul our luggage while walking in the ditch on the side of the road. And then a very kind lady who was just about to drive by saw us trekking in the ditch, slowed down, rolled down her window, and offered to give us a ride to wherever we were going. Two back-to-back instances of culture shock for me. That's not really something that we do in the Northwest, is just offer random strangers rides. But what was interesting is that after spending just a few days in Tulsa, the classic Southern hospitality was starting to rub off on me a little bit. And I found myself talking a little bit different to people. I was being cultured by the Tulsa culture. And this is an example of social fermentation, and it's actually really helpful in our understanding of fermentation when it comes to gardening, so we'll come back to it. For now, let's return to food. It's genuinely surprising when you take a look at almost all of the most beloved foods in the world and realize that they're fermented. Coffee beans and cacao are fermented from the moment that they're harvested until they're dried and roasted. Cheese is fermented milk. Of course, any alcoholic beverage needs to be fermented in order to have alcohol. And that alcohol, once generated by yeasts that convert sugars into ethanol, can then be further fermented by acetic acid bacteria that converts alcohol into vinegar. Tea, bread, soy sauce, vanilla extract, olives, traditional deli meats, even Tabasco hot sauce, all of these wonderful foods are fermented in one way or another at some point in their creation. But I want to showcase a couple different ferments that will provide an easy entry point into our gardening practice, because all of these you can do at home once you learn the process of fermentation, and it really unlocks a world of potential in the garden. There are two main categories of fermentation that I'm going to cover here: aerobic and anaerobic. Starting with our anaerobic ferments, we have things like sauerkraut, lacto-fermented veggies, and lacto-fermented hot sauce. Now, these are painfully easy to make. Salt is added to cabbage, moisture gets drawn out through the cabbage through osmotic pressure, and the resulting salty brine is what the cabbage is submerged in while it undergoes its fermentation journey to becoming sauerkraut. The salty environment creates the conditions that keep pathogenic molds from growing and keeps lactic acid bacteria cultures a-thriving. And these cultures culture the cabbage, softening the tissues and processing various compounds. And this process of fermentation has been used for thousands of years as a means of preserving cabbage. Once those bacterial cultures have established, it's hard for them to become compromised, which is what makes lacto-fermented foods so approachable and easy to make. For foods like peppers and radishes that I've got here, a saltwater brine is used to perform the same exact function as what happens with sauerkraut. And again, through the process of fermentation, the nutritional and flavor components of the food changes. These are what we call anaerobic ferments, and we'll return to them with one more in a little bit. First, let's take a look at some of our aerobic ferments. This one looks and acts similar to our lacto-fermented veggies, but it doesn't use salt and instead uses sugar to feed wild yeasts. This beverage is called tepache, and it's a traditional pre-Hispanic beverage made out of pineapple skins and spices. And in this case, natural yeasts and lactic acid bacteria found on the rind of the pineapple work together to consume sugar and water over a 3 to 5 day span. And as this happens, the Saccharomyces yeasts and heterofermentative lactic acid bacteria are going to work on the materials, feeding on the sugar and off-gassing carbon dioxide. And you can see bubbles in and on the surface of this batch of brewing tepache, but it really becomes obvious when you seal it up and let it continue to ferment anaerobically, because then when you pop the bottle, you can see the foam build up right away. Another similar sort of aerobic ferment is kombucha. This one differs from tepache a little bit in that it utilizes something called a SCOBY, which is an acronym for symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. This is also referred to as a mother culture. And for kombucha specifically, all scobies come from the same original mother culture that is thought to have originated thousands of years ago. Pretty cool. Another example of a really cool SCOBY is kefir. This is a kefir grain, and it's composed of bacteria and yeast found together in a symbiotic biofilm. Like a kombucha SCOBY, it's gelatinous, but unlike kombucha, it contains a very different culture, one that is primarily designed to ferment milk anaerobically. Although these cultures are extremely adaptable, and if you're interested in making your own cheese or learning more about kefir, I can't recommend David Asher's book, The Art of Natural Cheese Making, enough. He has and continues to do incredible work discovering the process of drawing out the various cultures found within kefir. And he does this to ferment milk in ways that result in a wide variety of traditional cheeses. Kefir is a really incredible ferment, and it's actually one that we're going to be experimenting with using in our garden this coming growing season. Now, both of these cultures, kombucha and kefir, multiply and expand their scobies, and kombucha, once strained off, can actually regrow a new SCOBY given enough time, which is what I'm going to do with this bottle because we're in the process of moving, and recently I lost my kombucha SCOBY to the molds. One more point on these foods is that, as you might be aware, when you consume these, and even if you use them as a form of skincare, the probiotic cultures impact our gut cultures in positive ways. In a sense, we're inoculating ourselves with beneficial microbial communities that make us healthier and less susceptible to illness. One more mother culture that I want to talk about here is the sourdough. And this one is going to give us a vitally important lesson that will bring us to the garden. A sourdough mother culture, otherwise known as a yeast starter, can be made at home with no ingredients other than flour and water. Just got to mix up equal parts flour and water, let it sit for a day and discard it, compost it, but don't clean the jar. And then in the same jar with the flour and water residue, mix up equal parts flour and water again, making sure to scrape the outer edges of the jar that have the residue from the day before and incorporate that into the new mixture. And then just repeat this process a few more days, discarding and replenishing it each day with new flour and water. And eventually, within a week, you should start to see bubbles, and it'll start smelling tangy. And this is characteristic of probably every ferment. They're going to smell tangy because these cultures establish and thrive in acidic conditions, which is what keeps them safe to consume, because the acid, among other things, keeps pathogens from growing. And so with a sourdough culture, what will have happened is that the natural yeasts in the air and the lactic acid bacteria in the flour culture the flour in the water mixture. And then this substance can be used as a source of yeast to ferment bread dough into bread that can be baked. This is a mother culture. However, and this is the crucial bit, you may be familiar with the sourdough from the iconic San Francisco sourdough bread. This bread was the first time that I had ever heard of sourdough, and you can actually buy a piece of the sourdough culture online. They'll ship it to you. It's the same one that they've used for over 200 years, and you can get some of it and start baking your own bread with it. However, the one problem with this is that the sourdough starter is not like kombucha or kefir. Kombucha and kefir both emerged as a specific set of strains of bacteria and yeast that persisted, slightly altered climate to climate, but they retain the same core cultures. Sourdough starter cultures take on the natural yeast cultures of wherever they're made and propagated. So if you get a San Francisco sourdough culture sent to you in the mail and start feeding it flour and water each day, it'll stay alive, but its microbial makeup is going to shift and adapt and change based on the conditions of your climate and what yeast do best there. And this harkens back to what I referred to as social fermentation. If you live in a different culture long enough, you start adopting attributes of that culture. It's the same thing for microbes. And this is our entry point into what I've heard some refer to as microbial terroir. And bear with me, because I know that this sounds a bit elitist and perhaps slightly floofy, but French terminology aside, this is something that we all experience to one degree or another. And I briefly touched on this in my book, A Home Gardener's Guide to Creating Natural Farming. I said earlier that fermentation has been the driving conceptual framework that has unlocked much of my understanding of soil biology. But it's also the driving motivator for me as I've learned what it means to unlock the unique characteristics of a particular growing area. The cultural expression of a people group is largely rooted in its expression of what the geography allows to be produced, largely the food that's able to be grown. It's been said that agriculture is the foundation of all other culture. And I think that this has to do with the unique weather patterns, soil types, and other geographical qualities that determine the unique microbial cultures that live there. So what does this mean for home gardening? I think that at a certain level, we garden because we want a certain quality of life, whether that's food to be harvested or aesthetics to be appreciated. And beyond those, there's the feeling that we get from when we touch soil and breathe in the air that's full of these living creatures. As overwhelming as it might feel, we are one actor at work in our gardens amongst trillions. And so gardening is a cultural act, not just a mechanical input-output activity. It's of course a spiritual experience in the sense that whether we realize it or not, we're in a collaborative effort with powers beyond our control and with which we commune. I said in a recent video that gardening is about stewardship. And there's nothing quite like stewarding the microbial quality of your growing space. So let's get practical. In what ways do our lessons on food fermentation inform how we might approach soil fermentation? Well, there are a couple of categories that I want to explore, and several of these that you've no doubt already engaged with if you've been gardening long. But the first ferment that most gardeners will engage with, whether intentionally or by accident, is mulching. And this may feel like a stretch, but if you think about it, take the tapache that I highlighted. Fermentation starts the moment the natural yeasts and bacteria are introduced to a food source, in this case, the sugar. When you spread leaves over the soil, you're providing the soil biology with a food source, one that it immediately begins to consume and decompose. Another, perhaps more intentional act of fermentation is an aerobic ferment that gardeners make called compost. Compost is the process of intentionally decomposing materials by providing food sources for microorganisms who break down those food sources into a nutrient-rich soil-like substance. Like our other ferments, the process of making compost causes microbial respiration, which, since we're working with such a large quantity of material, the compost piles heat up in temperature. There's so much microbial activity happening. And when this microbe-rich substance is introduced to our garden soil, we're in a sense culturing the soil with the compost culture. You can also treat your compost like a sourdough starter and reserve some of it for your next batch that you make. And the microbes in the compost are going to culture the next pile, kickstarting that process of fermentation. Another aerobic ferment is vermicompost, and this is a really interesting one, but I really consider my worm bin and the worm population as a SCOBY, probably because I've given worms away so many times and received back batches over the years when I let mine die. But this group of microorganisms function in similar ways to a starter culture that can then be used as a way of inoculating soil, whether by direct application or when brewed in an aerated worm casting tea and then sprayed throughout the garden. Let's dip into some anaerobic ferments that we can make for the garden. Fermented plant juice is a very similar process in some ways as the process of making sauerkraut. Instead of salt, we use sugar to extract moisture, again through osmotic pressure, from plant debris that's then fermented and preserved in a syrupy, sugary brine. This moisture contains the stuff that we're after, the enzymes, hormones, microbes, and nutrients from the plant debris. And then it's what we use to uniquely culture our plants during the early stages of plant growth. So we're extracting these beneficial compounds and applying the culture to our plants as a way of signaling to them to perform various biological functions. With lactic acid bacteria, which we can use kefir and yogurt way for this as well, or we can make it the traditional way by fermenting starch water and using that to culture milk. But when we spray this culture on our plants, we're culturing the foliage. When we apply it to the soil, we're inoculating the soil and altering the environment subtly but impactfully, because we're using the same culture that crowds out pathogens to inhabit our plant bodies and the soil that they live in. This is like when we consume fermented foods that are beneficial to our gut health. And we could go on through all of the different inputs that we teach on this channel and demonstrate how they work and affect our gardens. But the last area that I find the most interesting in the world of gardening inputs is related to microbial terroir. And I didn't say it before, but terroir is the French term often referring to food and wine as the sense of place, or the unique characteristics that generate the unique flavors and textures of a given food. And so the microbial terroir refers to the microbes that uniquely inhabit and affect the way that a garden expresses itself within its unique environment. Now, you may have guessed where I'm heading with this, but it's hard to imagine a better way to bring that expression of microbial terroir to the garden than by culturing and cultivating and applying indigenous microorganisms. And you can check out our tutorials on how exactly we do this. But what I find interesting is that the technique that I use most often now is one that looks remarkably similar to a traditional fermented Japanese food called koji. And you may or may not be familiar with koji, but it's used as an ingredient in a lot of Japanese cuisine and as a starter culture for a lot of traditional ferments. And so it's no surprise that Han Kyu-cho, the creator of Korean natural farming, studied and adapted traditional Japanese farming techniques and practices, because when you look at the way that he taught us how to collect indigenous microorganisms, it's very similar to the process of culturing koji, using these cooked grains to attract and feed microorganisms in the soil from nature, only to further ferment them and carefully tend to them, growing them gradually onto new substrates and allowing them to mature. Has to be one of the most elegant forms of natural farming ever. Rather than relying on a pre-existing mother culture with which to inoculate the grains, there's a similar effect to the sourdough starter culture, where the unique characteristics of the environment create the same general bacterial and fungal cultures that are found everywhere, but also contain unique subspecies of those cultures in each given environment. Bringing the unique microbial qualities of your given natural environment into your personal growing space is an exciting proposition when it comes to bringing out the best qualities of your area. Of course, growing anything in your own soil will contain the unique cultures already present in your area. And so, if anything, we can all just be a little bit more aware of the powerful processes at work that are designing our gardens for us. I know this got a little esoteric at the end here, so I appreciate you journeying with me in considering how fermentation really impacts my gardening experience, and I hope it impacts yours as well. If this inspired you or got you thinking, send me an email to taylor@thegriffinfamilyfarm.com. I would love to hear from you. Make sure to check out our free resources available, linked in the description. And if you enjoyed this video and are interested in getting started with a few of the easier fermented gardening inputs that you can make, you'll want to check out this video next. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.